Picture the coldest night you've ever survived. Now strip away your heating, your walls, your blankets, your boots. Drop the temperature another 30 degrees below whatever you're imagining right now. Do that every single night, for 6 months straight, for 11,000 years in a row. That wasn't a hypothetical scenario for our ancestors. That was Tuesday. That was every Tuesday, for roughly 100,000 years, during a period scientists call the last glacial period, when ice sheets over 2 miles thick buried most of North America and Europe, and the average human being alive on this planet was expected to survive winters so brutal that modern Arctic explorers, wrapped head to toe in synthetic thermal gear engineered by teams of scientists, still sometimes lose fingers to frostbite in conditions less severe than what a Paleolithic hunter faced, wearing nothing but stitched animal hide. So here's the actual question worth asking. How does a species with no fur, no natural insulation, and a body built for the warm plains of Africa not just survive an ice age, but spread across it, hunt in it, raise children in it, and eventually paint some of the most breathtaking art in human history on the walls of caves buried under it? The answer involves a needle sharper than anything else on Earth at the time, a fire that had to survive its own transportation across entire continents, shelters built from the bones of animals bigger than the humans hunting them, and the uncomfortable reality that the modern human body should not, by any reasonable measure, have been able to do any of this at all. Let's start with the problem underneath the problem, because it isn't actually the cold itself that kills first. It's heat loss speed. The human body maintains a core temperature of roughly 37 degrees Celsius, and it will fight ferociously to protect that number no matter what the environment throws at it, shutting down blood flow to the extremities first, sacrificing fingers and toes to protect the organs that keep a person alive. In dry cold, a body can hold that line for a surprisingly long time. But introduce wind, movement, or a single gap in insulation, and heat escapes fast enough to become lethal within hours, not days. This meant Ice Age humans weren't just fighting temperature. They were fighting physics, and physics does not negotiate. Clothing, then, wasn't a comfort item. It was the single piece of technology standing between a person and death, and the evidence for just how sophisticated it became is written directly onto ancient tools themselves. Archaeologists have recovered eyed needles crafted from bone and ivory dating back roughly 40,000 years, found at sites across Siberia and Europe, and the presence of that needle changes the entire story. A draped hide keeps you warm standing still. A tailored, fitted garment, sewn tightly at the seams with sinew thread, traps warm air against the body and keeps wind from finding its way through every gap a looser wrap would leave exposed. Researchers studying the clothing worn by Ice Age populations in Siberia, including layered garments reconstructed from burial evidence at sites like Sungir in Russia, describe multi-layer systems strikingly similar in principle to modern Arctic gear. An inner layer for warmth, an outer layer for wind and moisture resistance, fitted precisely enough to move, run, and throw a spear without ever exposing bare skin to open air. And this had to be done entirely without the animal that made it easiest available nearby. Different furs offered wildly different performance, and Ice Age communities clearly knew the difference. Reindeer and wolf fur, in particular, were prized for a specific reason modern textile science only recently explained. Their hollow guard hairs trap air with unusual efficiency, creating insulation so effective that some Arctic cultures still rely on it today. Choosing centuries-old animal fur over synthetic alternatives engineered in laboratories, because in genuinely extreme cold, it still performs better. This wasn't guesswork passed down by accident. It was tested, refined knowledge, carried forward across generations of people who could not afford to get it wrong even once. Shelter posed an entirely different problem, because in the coldest, most exposed parts of the Ice Age world, the usual answer, find a cave, simply wasn't available. On the open mammoth steppes stretching across Ukraine and Russia, there were no convenient rock shelters for hundreds of miles in any direction. So people built their own, out of the only large, weather-resistant material the landscape offered in abundance, the bones of mammoths. At sites like Mazirik in Ukraine, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of dwellings built from dozens of mammoth bones and tusks, arranged deliberately into a circular framework and likely covered with hides stretched tightly across the structure. Building something like this wasn't a weekend project. A single dwelling could require the bones of more than a dozen mammoths, meaning it represented not just architectural skill, but an entire logistics operation. Hunting, transporting, and assembling material heavier and more unwieldy than almost anything else available in that environment, all before a single wall could go up. Inside those shelters, and inside every version of Ice Age survival anywhere on the planet, sat the one technology that made everything else possible: fire. Evidence of controlled fire use stretches back hundreds of thousands of years before the Ice Age even began, but during the glacial period itself, fire stopped being a convenience and became the actual center of daily survival, gathering an entire social unit around it every single night out of pure necessity, not preference. Fire meant warmth, obviously, but it also meant something easy to overlook today. It meant the difference between eating raw frozen meat that cost enormous energy for the body to digest in the cold and eating cooked meat that delivered usable calories fast enough to actually matter when the next meal wasn't guaranteed for days. Researchers studying hearths at Ice Age sites have found evidence that some groups didn't just use fire, they engineered it, digging pits to concentrate heat, lining them with stone to hold warmth longer after the flames themselves had died down for the night, extending the usable warmth of a single fire well past when the wood itself had burned out. And fire had to survive travel, which sounds almost absurd until you consider what it actually meant in practice. Ice Age humans were not sedentary. Many groups followed migrating herds of reindeer, horses, and mammoths across enormous distances, meaning fire couldn't simply be built once and left behind. It had to be carried, protected from wind and snow during transport, and re-established at every new camp, a task that fell to specific, practiced hands within the group, because a failed fire in the wrong conditions wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence for everyone depending on it that night. Food strategies shifted just as dramatically as shelter and clothing did, because the Ice Age didn't just bring cold, it brought scarcity, stretching the available calories across a landscape that offered far less plant food than the warmer world humans had evolved in originally. This pushed many Ice Age populations toward diets extraordinarily high in animal fat and protein, out of necessity rather than preference, since fat specifically delivered the dense, slow-burning energy the body needed to generate heat through the coldest stretches of the year. Evidence from sites across Europe suggests hunters targeted mammoth and other megafauna partly for exactly this reason. A single mammoth represented an enormous stockpile of fat and meat, capable of sustaining a group for weeks when properly preserved, and preservation itself became its own specialized skill. Meat could be frozen naturally in ground caches dug into permafrost, essentially turning the frozen earth itself into a natural deep freezer, keeping food edible for months at a stretch in a landscape that offered no other reliable way to store it. Here's where the story gets genuinely remarkable, though, because surviving the Ice Age wasn't simply about grinding through it with better gear and better food. Human populations didn't just endure this period. Certain groups appear to have thrived within it, and the clearest evidence for that sits on the walls of caves like Chauvet and Lascaux in France, where Ice Age artists, working entirely by the flickering light of animal fat lamps deep underground, created paintings of staggering technical skill, depicting horses, lions, and mammoths with a command of movement and perspective that still stops modern viewers in their tracks tens of thousands of years later. This wasn't the output of a species barely scraping by. This was the output of communities stable enough, fed enough, and secure enough in their survival systems to have time, energy, and attention left over for something that wasn't strictly necessary for staying alive, which might be the single most telling detail in this entire story. And then, roughly 11,700 years ago, the ice began its retreat, gradually at first, and then dramatically, as the planet warmed and the glaciers that had defined the known world for tens of thousands of years began pulling back toward the poles. Populations who had spent countless generations perfecting the art of surviving extreme cold now faced the opposite challenge entirely: adapting to a warming world, following retreating herds, and eventually shifting toward entirely new ways of life that would, in time, lead toward agriculture, permanent settlement, and everything that followed. But the knowledge didn't vanish. The needle, the fitted garment, the underground cache, the engineered hearth, all of it carried forward, reshaped generation after generation, embedded so deeply into how humans solve problems that traces of it still show up today. In Arctic communities relying on layered fur clothing their ancestors would recognize instantly. In outdoor gear companies studying prehistoric insulation techniques for modern products. In the simple, stubborn fact that a species with no fur and no natural defense against extreme cold looked at an ice age that should have wiped it out entirely, and instead, generation after generation, figured out exactly how to make it home.